The grand corridors of Buckingham Palace have always been filled with whispers, but on this particular morning, the silence was heavy, almost suffocating. Publicly, the official statements from the royal press office were keeping everything completely vague, maintaining the usual protocol of secrecy that the institution had relied on for centuries. The official bulletin stated that King Charles was resting comfortably, receiving the highest standard of medical care, and remaining under the watchful eyes of the best physicians in the country. These were the standard, polished lines that told the public absolutely nothing of substance, designed to project an image of stability and calm to a world that was constantly watching. But behind the heavy, gilded doors, inside the private quarters of the monarch, a far more serious and volatile situation was unfolding in the shadows. The people who were closest to the king were not spending their precious hours praying for his swift recovery or comforting one another in a time of family crisis. Instead, they were quietly making calculated moves, scanning the room for opportunities, and preparing for a massive shift in the balance of power. To understand the gravity of what happened next, we have to talk about a man named Colin, a figure who had managed to blend into the background of royal life for years. If you follow royal coverage with any degree of close attention, you already know that Queen Camilla has always maintained her own fiercely loyal inner circle within the palace walls. She surrounded herself with a dedicated staff, long-serving aides, and people who had been in her personal orbit for decades, individuals who knew exactly how the complex machinery of the monarchy worked and where the vulnerabilities lay. Colin was exactly that kind of guy, highly trusted, incredibly capable, and apparently completely willing to throw every single ounce of that hard-earned trust straight into a massive dumpster fire the very moment he saw a golden opportunity. Because while King Charles was lying in his royal bed, pale, weak, and barely conscious under the influence of heavy medication, Colin was not standing guard outside the door to ensure the monarch's privacy or making sure that the king had everything he needed to rest. Instead, he was quietly slipping inside that darkened bedroom in the middle of the night, wearing thin black gloves, moving with such absolute silence that he genuinely believed no one in the world would ever notice his presence. What he was actively hunting for in that room tells you everything you need to know about the ruthless mindset of the people involved in this operation. The very first item he managed to secure was a small, unassuming black key card. This was not just any ordinary electronic access card that low-level staff used. This was the highly restricted master key to the deepest inner palace vault. It was the digital key that granted immediate access to the heavily fortified room where the royal family kept their most valuable antiquities, the priceless jewelry, the historic heirlooms, and items that had been passed down through generations of British monarchs. These were the kinds of historic treasures that would fetch absolutely insane, astronomical prices on the global black market if you happened to know the right international buyers. And as it turned out, Colin knew exactly the right people to contact to liquidate those assets quickly. But he didn't stop there. He also reached over and grabbed King Charles's personal mobile phone, the distinct leather-bound device that the king used exclusively for his most private and sensitive communications. Think about what that actually means in the context of global power. That single device contained direct, unmonitored lines to top political advisors, high-ranking government officials, and the most confidential inner workings of the modern monarchy. Stealing it was not just about trying to sell the physical hardware or wiping the memory for a quick profit. It was a deliberate strategy to cut King Charles off completely from the outside world, making him effectively blind, deaf, and totally isolated inside his own home while he was far too physically weak to fight back or sound the alarm. But here is the exact part of the story that makes the entire situation significantly worse than a simple case of theft. Queen Camilla herself was standing right there. She wasn't hidden away in another wing of the palace. She was standing directly at the doorway, her arms folded tightly across her chest, watching Colin methodically search the room and commit the act. And when Colin finished and turned around to check if the coast was clear, Camilla did not gasp or stop him. Instead, she gave him a small, deliberate nod of her head, a quiet, chilling confirmation that everything was proceeding exactly according to their plan. That single gesture right there is what completely separates this incident from a rogue employee making a terrible, isolated decision. This was a highly coordinated, meticulously planned operation. Camilla was not an innocent bystander who would find out about the missing items later and react with horror. She was the very person who had authorized the intrusion and sent him into that room in the first place. Now, here is the crucial element that neither of them had accounted for in their arrogance. King Charles was awake the entire time. He had not taken his prescribed nightly sedatives, or perhaps he had taken them and they simply weren't working the way the medical staff had assumed they would. But either way, those royal eyes were open just enough in the darkness to witness every single detail of the betrayal happening before him. He heard Colin cross the plush-carpeted floor. He heard the quiet slide of the nightstand drawer opening. He watched that black-gloved hand reach in and pull out the master key card. And most devastatingly of all, he saw his wife, Camilla, standing in that dimly lit doorway, giving her silent nod of approval. This was the woman he had spent decades fiercely defending to the cynical public, a woman the entire country had eventually, reluctantly accepted as queen after years of intense controversy and media storms. That very same woman was now standing there, authorizing a literal robbery from his own bedroom while he lay defenseless and sick in his bed. Yet, the king did not scream out for help, and he did not call for the guards who were stationed further down the hallway. What King Charles did instead was something far more deliberate, cold, and calculated. Once the door clicked shut and the footsteps faded away, he waited a long beat in the silence, and then he slowly, painfully pushed himself upright. Anyone who has ever watched an elderly person attempt to recover from a severe physical illness knows exactly how much strength that simple movement costs. Every single shift of weight, every slight effort was a brutal negotiation with a frail body that desperately wanted to remain completely still. But Charles forced himself up. He reached his shaking hand toward a silver picture frame resting on the nightstand, which contained a group photo taken during a private royal banquet. In the photo, Camilla was standing right at the center, glowing, while Colin and the rest of her loyal entourage surrounded her with their best, most sycophantic smiles for the camera. Charles then pulled a heavy fountain pen from beneath his pillow, a gold-nibbed instrument that he had clearly kept hidden there for a specific purpose, and he dragged it across that photograph with immense force. He drew hard, angry diagonal lines straight through Colin's face, carving deep, permanent gouges through every single hypocritical smile captured in that image, the thick red ink bleeding across the glossy paper, like a final verdict being written in real time. This was not a childish tantrum born of sudden grief or panic. This was the action of a monarch making a definitive, irreversible decision about the future of his household. Charles slowly got dressed, wrapped a heavy robe around his shoulders, and walked out into the cold, silent corridor of the palace. And waiting there in the shadows, completely still, standing with her hands clasped firmly behind her back and absolutely zero emotion on her stern face, was Princess Anne. She wore no expensive jewelry and offered no polite small talk. She simply maintained that famously no-nonsense posture, her sharp eyes looking as though she was merely seconds away from completely dissolving anyone who crossed her with a single, icy look. And already knew exactly what had just transpired within that bedroom because she had been watching the security feeds closely. She was merely waiting for Charles to step out and give the official signal to commence their counter-strategy. And when the king walked out of that room and placed a heavy, solid brass keyring directly into her palm, the specific ring that controlled the palace's entire internal security infrastructure, she didn't ask a single question. She closed her fingers tightly around the cold metal, held her brother's gaze for one profound moment, and then turned sharply on her heel, walking straight into the darkness of the lower levels. What happened next is an absolute masterclass on how ancient, established power actually moves when it decides to eliminate a threat within its walls. No royal guards were mobilized in a panic, no loud alarms were triggered to alert the household, and there were no dramatic, booming announcements echoing through the long hallways to cause a scandal. Princess Anne went completely alone, descending a narrow, spiral stone staircase that led deep into the ancient basement of the palace, navigating her way to the central cable junction room that controls every single communication line running through the massive estate. She scanned the wall of wires until she located the dark red cable bundle, the dedicated communication line that had been installed specifically for Camilla's private quarters and her personal entourage. This was the line they used for absolutely everything, from directing their loyal staff and managing their carefully curated public image, to, as it would soon be revealed, making clandestine arrangements with some very shady, underground antique buyers in London. And pulled out a pair of heavy, professional industrial bolt cutters from the shadows, lined up the sharp steel blades with precision, and cut straight through the entire bundle of wires in one single, powerful motion. The severing was clean, total, and immediate. Every single indicator light on Camilla's section of the central security control panel went completely dark at the exact same moment. 3 floors above them, inside a luxurious third-floor lounge, Colin's phone screen went completely black right in the middle of him dialing number. The very moment that communication signal died, the entire mood inside that room shifted instantly from arrogant celebration to absolute, chilling confusion. Just 1 second prior, the group had been quietly celebrating their success, dividing up their future roles, and already mentally spending the massive amounts of money that weren't theirs to claim. The next second, every single electronic device in that room was dead. Colin tapped his phone screen repeatedly, but nothing happened. He grabbed the king's phone, the device he had just stolen, but it too showed absolutely no signs of life. Another person in the room tried to turn on the television, but it produced only a brief flash of static before going permanently black. Even the walkie-talkies they had been using to coordinate their movements with contacts outside the building came back with nothing but dead silence and white static noise. Every single line to the outside world was entirely gone, and you could almost feel the physical air leave the room as panic began to set in. The suffocating silence inside the third-floor lounge was rapidly expanding, turning the once triumphant atmosphere into a pressure cooker of sheer desperation. Colin stood frozen in the center of the lavish room, his fingers gripping King Charles's stolen leather-bound phone so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He stared blankly at the dark screen, desperately hoping for a flicker of light, a single bar of signal, or any sign that this sudden technological blackout was just a temporary glitch in the palace's massive infrastructure. But deep down, a cold dread was beginning to wrap itself around his spine, whispering that this was no accident. For months, Colin and his carefully selected associates had operated under the absolute conviction that their proximity to the highest levels of royal power made them completely untouchable, viewing the ancient institution not with respect, but as a defenseless vault waiting to be systematically picked clean. They had grown incredibly bold, mistake-free up to this point, moving through the historic corridors with the swagger of men who believed they were chess masters playing against a fading, defenseless king. But now, with every single line of communication severed in an instant, that carefully constructed illusion of control was violently shattered. The outside contacts who were supposed to be waiting near the secure perimeter gates with transport vehicles were now entirely unreachable, leaving Colin's exit strategy completely buried under a mountain of dead signals. In a smarter, more disciplined criminal operation, the sudden loss of power and communications would be a clear, undeniable cue to immediately halt all movements, drop any incriminating evidence, and attempt to blend back into the normal palace routine before the dawn guards changed. But panic mixed with immense greed is a highly volatile and predictable psychological combination, and these were individuals whose judgment had been thoroughly warped by the sheer scale of the wealth sitting just a few floors below them. Rather than retreating or laying low in the dark, their survival instincts kicked in exactly the way Prince William had systematically predicted they would during his long hours of counterplanning. Colin straightened his jacket, took a deep, shaky breath to stabilize his racing heart, and sharply signaled to his remaining crew to move out of the lounge immediately. Instead of abandoning the mission, they allowed their desperation to accelerate it, grabbing their heavy felt bags and rapidly stuffing them with whatever valuable items they could violently snatch from the nearby display cases as they moved. Gold figurines, diamond-encrusted cufflinks, and historical engraved medals that had been quietly collected over what was clearly a sustained, multi-month insider operation were shoved into the sacks. They were heading directly for the central royal vault, driven by the reckless belief that if they could just secure the highest value antiquities before the palace security fully realized what was happening, they could still find a way to force their way out. What Colin did not know, and what his profound arrogance prevented him from even imagining, was that Prince William had been counting on exactly this panicked reaction. While Princess Anne was deep in the ancient stone basement of the palace, using heavy bolt cutters to systematically isolate Camilla's quarters from the world, William was inside a small, cluttered security monitoring room located near the main palace archives. With his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows and a set of specialized tools in hand, the prince had spent the late-night hours personally dismantling the outdated magnetic card reader on the vault's main heavily reinforced entrance. In its place, he had carefully installed a state-of-the-art biometric fingerprint sensor, cleverly concealed beneath the original, aged brass casing of the palace fixture. This system was not just designed to deny access to unauthorized users. It was hardwired into the building's emergency defense mechanism, meaning that if an unregistered print attempted to force the lock, it would automatically trigger a permanent electromagnetic seal on every single security door within a 10-meter radius. This was the kind of industrial-grade lock that completely ignored manual overrides, physical pressure, or structural tampering, transforming a secure corridor into an inescapable steel cage within a fraction of a second. But William did not just want to stop Colin and his associates outside the vault doors. He wanted them to willingly step all the way into the trap before they even realized a trap existed. To guarantee this, William had intentionally wedged open the massive, reinforced side door to the vault's outer antechamber, just enough to allow a thin, sharp line of bright yellow light to spill out across the dark, unlit hallway. In a wing where every single overhead wall light had been deliberately cut by the security grid, that tiny strip of yellow illumination acted like a powerful beacon in the darkness, looking precisely like an open door, a sudden security oversight, and a golden opportunity for a group of panicked thieves sprinting through a dark palace in the dead of night. William then quietly retreated into the deep shadows behind a massive, towering marble statue of an ancient monarch, stood completely still, and began monitoring the live thermal tracking data broadcasting directly to his smartwatch. The distinct red, representing Colin's real-time location, was transmitting perfectly, powered by a hidden tracking chip buried deep inside the internal hardware of the king's personal phone, the very device Colin believed was his greatest prize of the night. On the digital screen, the red was moving with frantic speed through the elaborate West Wing, changing directions, doubling back through servant stairwells, but always ultimately trending toward the main vault corridor, drawing closer to the trap with every passing second. When Colin and his breathless group finally reached the end of the long hallway and saw the faint light escaping from the antechamber door, they didn't hesitate for a single moment, their greed completely blinding them to the unnatural nature of the situation. They pushed through the opening, crowding their bodies into the small, steel-reinforced room with their heavy bags of stolen property scraping against the stone. Colin stepped up to the main vault door with a triumphant grin, pulled the stolen black master key card from his breast pocket, and swiped it firmly through the reader slot. A harsh, solid red light flashed on the panel. He frowned, his heart skipping a violent beat, and swiped the card a second time, pressing it harder against the mechanism. The solid red light flashed again, accompanied by a low, mechanical hum that signaled an immediate system error. Before anyone in the room could utter a word of confusion, the trap activated with brutal, automated efficiency. The massive electromagnets embedded deep within the steel door frames behind them fired instantly, pulling the heavy side door through which they had entered shut with a full, terrifying force of several hundred pounds of pressurized steel. Heavy industrial deadbolts, each the thickness of a man's wrist, drove violently through the joints of the frame, locking every single possible way out with an echoing, metallic thud that signaled total finality. A split second later, the harsh, white fluorescent overhead lights blazed on at full intensity, flooding the tiny, windowless room with a blinding glare that left absolutely nowhere to hide and nothing left to do except stand there squinting in the light, completely trapped with bags of stolen royal treasures sitting uselessly at their feet. Colin threw his entire body weight against the reinforced steel door, his panicked crew following his lead, pounding their fists against the smooth metal, yanking on the disabled emergency handle, and screaming into the silence. But there was absolutely no give, no structural weakness, and no sound returning from the other side of the wall, except, after a long and torturous minute of silence, the slow, rhythmic sound of approaching footsteps. The thick, reinforced glass observation panel in the wall slowly slid open with a quiet hiss, and Prince William stepped into view on the other side, his dress shirt sleeves still rolled up, his hands resting calmly inside his pockets. He didn't speak immediately. He simply stood there looking through the glass at Colin with a cold, detached gaze, the way an apex predator looks at an insect that has already been thoroughly dealt with and removed from the board. Beside the princess and materialized from the darkness, her arms tightly crossed over her chest, her sharp eyes moving systematically across the heavy felt bags and the stolen contents spilling onto the floor, taking a silent, clinical inventory of the betrayal. Behind both of them, a solid line of elite royal guards in dark tactical uniforms filled the outer doorway, their faces completely expressionless and their presence absolute. Colin's mouth opened to speak, to offer some desperate lie or negotiate a way out, but no words could form in his throat as the sheer weight of his complete defeat settled over him. The stolen Black Master key card slipped from his trembling fingers, hitting the hard floor with a sharp click that seemed to echo through the reinforced chamber. And then, breaking the heavy silence of the outer corridor, came the distinct, rapid sound of high heels moving fast down the stone hallway toward the security room. Queen Camilla arrived, her deep red cape flowing behind her, her hair perfectly styled but her face twisted into a highly theatrical expression of utter shock, confusion, and manufactured outrage. She aggressively pushed her way past the guards, positioning her body directly in front of the glass partition, as if she were a protective shield for the people trapped on the other side, and turned to William with a face that had been carefully rehearsed to project complete innocence. She pointed her finger directly at Colin through the glass, her voice trembling with a masterful display of victimhood as she demanded to know how these trusted employees could have committed such a horrific, unforgivable betrayal against the entire royal family. It was a flawless performance, executed with real commitment by a woman who had survived decades of public scrutiny. William stood entirely still, letting her finish every single word of her dramatic tirade without interrupting. And when she finally stopped to catch her breath, the prince calmly reached into his pocket, pulled out a small, rectangular black audio receiver, placed it gently on the table directly in front of her, and pressed the play button. The small black receiver hummed, and Camilla's own voice vibrated through the security room, shattering her illusion of innocence. The playback was crystal clear, capturing the exact conversation she held with Colin hours earlier. "Take the phone, take the key card, and move while the palace is blind," her recorded voice commanded. It had been transmitted directly through a hidden military-grade tracking chip inside King Charles's phone, the device Colin believed was his greatest prize. Camilla's arm dropped, her theatrical performance evaporating into a heavy, absolute silence. William simply turned away with cold detachment and delivered a final look of profound contempt. What followed was a clinical, swift operation by elite guards. Colin and his lackeys were restrained, and their official royal insignias were physically ripped from their uniforms. Underneath their heavy coats, a massive cache of stolen properties, priceless historic jewelry and gold antiquities, was uncovered, exposing a months-long insider theft operation. The thieves were marched down narrow service corridors and shoved out into the freezing, pre-dawn rain through the iron rear gates, which slammed shut with absolute finality. No flashing police lights, no public media spectacles, just the wet cobblestones and the crushing realization that their leverage was permanently gone. Camilla's punishment was handled internally, designed to be far more agonizing than physical expulsion. She was permitted to remain in her private wing and walk the same red-carpeted hallways, but every door that mattered was now permanently locked. King Charles's study featured a new biometric lock blinking with an unyielding red light. Palace staff intentionally kept their eyes on the floor whenever she passed, under strict administrative orders from William. Doors actively clicked shut as her footsteps approached. No one bowed, and no one acknowledged her voice. The Queen was still in the building, but the building had stopped recognizing her existence. Meanwhile, King Charles remained still in his bedroom, having allowed the ancient machinery of royal self-preservation to execute its work. The image of the sick king pushing himself upright with shaking arms to cross out the faces on the banquet photograph remained the defining moment of the story. The royal family had watched the conspiracy mature, waiting with immense patience until every piece of evidence was secure before delivering a cold, quietly devastating counterstroke. Colin and Camilla walked into a sealed room because their unyielding greed blinded them to the trap, proving that when the crown decides to protect itself, it moves with an absolute finality that leaves no room for survival.